Eric.
Hey, how's it going, Ashley?
Hey, you can't see me.
I presume you
Hi.
exist. Hello.
Everyone else is in break for another 5 minutes, but they'll be over.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Can let me see how I need to get my screen shared with you, right?
Yeah.
Oops. Oh, I see.
Okay.
Okay. So you're seeing my face and the slideshow, or just the slideshow?
I'm seeing your face and the slideshow.
Okay, cool. And is it readable, or should I?
Let me full screen it because you're not currently full screen, and then we'll see.
Because maybe I should let me turn my face off, and then you'll have more real estate for the slideshow, maybe.
Okay, great. Yeah,
I'll just be a ghostly, disembodied.
That's great. That's just a slide. It looks awesome.
Okay, cool. And you can read the smaller text?
Yep.
Okay,
it's as
wonderful.
though you were here with the slides.
Say again?
It's exactly as though you were here. That's how big the slides are.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Cool.
Thanks again for letting me do this remotely. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much
I know you can't see me smiling in appreciation, but I promise you.
No, thanks so much for being here. I'm really interested in your project.
I know.
I'm always interested in your projects, but oh my gosh,
so I was at ALA this morning, which is why I can't be there.
Oh, okay.
And I really wanted to see your paper. I didn't know until you sent around the titles that you were working on a similar, like another anthology project.
Yep. Yeah. I'm doing another heat, but Norton obviously was super interesting to me too. So.
Yeah. We'll have to talk about this obviously, like either today or soon.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is there I want to make sure. Well, anyway, I'll probably reference like the fact that there's overlap between our projects, but also sheepishly allude to the fact that I didn't get to see your talk this morning. And go from there.
Yeah, that sounds great. Cool.
Okay, cool.
All right, you're set up.
Sounds good. So I'll just, I guess, let me know, and I'll keep an eye on the screen, and when people come in, I'll.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, I'll go run and tell them to come on in.
Okay.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Hey.
So that seemed like
Great.
okay.
Call C. Okay.
All right, welcome back to SyncDH afternoon session. So here online we have Eric Fredner. He is going to talk to us about first steps toward a quantitative history of the Norton Anthology from the Stanford Literary Lab. All right, Eric.
I will be sort of a disembodied presence, I suppose, but I wanted to say thanks to everyone at Transcriptions and UCSB for letting me come in and talk about this. This is in the spirit of the slam, this is a project at the Literary Lab. We've been working on it intermittently for the last 2 months or so, and I'm really excited to share where we are with you. So we're interested in looking at, in very general terms, the history and changing contents of the Norton Anthologies, which is the longest running anthology series in English. So the first question we have to address is, why should we study the Nortons? This is centered on a matter of, well, in part, one of the main interests that we have in it is this tension that we see running throughout the Norton, which is the simultaneous desire to construct what we might think of as a canon, while simultaneously producing a text or publication that is of pedagogical use. So they serve this dual function, which is kind of at the heart of what we're working on in this project, thinking about the strains back and forth between the statement of canonicity for inclusion or exclusion in the Norton Anthology, and then how that relates to the ways in which these texts are used in the classrooms, which is their primary sort of purpose. So what kind of canon do the anthologies construct? And since it is the longest running anthology series, how has that canon changed between 1962, which is the publication of the first Norton Anthology of English, and then its present iterations? And there's kind of a funny side story here about the Norton as an economic product, as much as it is an educational and canonical product. M.H. Abrams is the original editor, or was the original editor of the Norton Anthology in English, and Harold Bloom in 1975 wanted to create a sort of counter anthology with the Oxford anthologies. And Bloom ran, I think, 2 editions of the Oxford, and then sort of in a note ceded the anthology field to Abrams. And the Norton Anthology has persisted since then. There, of course, exist, as Ashley talked about this morning, other anthologies, the Broadview, the Heath, etc. But our interest in the Norton stems from its perceived, at least in our institutional experiences, dominance. How these anthologies impact teaching is an important question. How the anthology functions as a publication. And then I think one of the things that we might be able to capture with this transhistorical consideration of the things included and excluded from the anthology is the way in which the content of the anthology relates to the profession of literary criticism. So based on this tension I've been talking about between the pedagogical and the canonical instincts of the Nortons, I created a set of parallel questions for how we might think of the Nortons as expressions of a canon and as pedagogical tools. And each of these pairs of questions, I think we've operationalized our data set in such a way that we'll be able to address either. And the notion is that in the project, we sort of have to hold both in mind as we work throughout. So as like sort of an interesting and key question, which works were absent in early editions of the Nortons and later added, that is, who was not in the canon and subsequently added to it, and as pedagogical tools, which works became newly useful across the history of the anthologies for this pedagogical purpose. And relatedly, and something that I'm going to talk about a little later in the presentation, is this question of the representative work. So of course you think about someone like Shakespeare, whose reputation hasn't exactly had any dips in the history of scholarship, like English literature scholarship. So how have the works selected to represent Shakespeare in the various iterations of the anthology changed across time? And what does that imply about what students are learning about these quote-unquote major authors by reading the Nortons in these survey courses at different points? So the point, I want to provide a brief like argument for and reminder of the way in which the Nortons are structured to sort of make this point. So if we think about each edition, each is comprised of a set of volumes. So for example, we think about the American Literature volume, those are time bounded specifically across usually a set of years. The volume starts with a general introduction to the cultural and political history of the period, talking about, in the American context, for example, various presidencies, the American presence abroad, and then of course, the ways in which those political and cultural facts relate in general terms to literary production of the period. This edition, for example, talks about the so-called American Renaissance and how that relates to the pre and post-bellum period. Then you have, and I think this is quite interesting, a year-by-year timeline in the anthologies that goes from a single year and lists a set of authors and events that sort of correlate. So for example, you think of the 1850 passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, and then in 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin in the next column. There's obviously a causative relationship between those two particular things, but it's also a normative representation of time that suggests causality in a case unlike the Stowe, where it might be less self-evident, where we might want to press back against it. So after you go through the introduction and the timeline, you finally get to the authors. But before you read the author's work, you get this brief scholarly introduction to the first person who's included in the anthology. And these have changed really dramatically across the history of the Norton. As perhaps you might expect, they initially began in the 60s and 70s editions. There were more statements of sort of laudatoriness and praise and expressions of greatness and justification for inclusion in that way. The current versions are quite different in a lot of respects, focusing on the ways in which they're being read, but they do still occasionally have a sort of general attestation to an author's broader cultural import or greatness, for lack of a better term. And then finally, you get to the text in question. Okay. So that's the general structure of the Norton volume. And what we're particularly interested in pulling from that structure is the selection of texts and the sub-selection of sections of text for a given author from the current version of the anthology, going all the way back to the initial editions of the anthologies and everything in between. So we can track and see across time which selections do and do not get included. And we've been joking, of course, the image on the right here is a reproduction of the table of contents of the current version. We've been joking about the challenge of this being moving data from Microsoft Word structuring formats into something that is more computationally useful. The logic here, as you can see, and as I'll talk about in a minute, is quite visual in nature and inconsistent. And so we have a lot of challenges ahead in terms of operationalizing and really doing a lot of manual data entry to break down and interpret the way in which this information has been structured. So as by way of example, here is Melville's current citation, or his table of contents entry in the current edition of the American Anthology. So you have the author, you have birth, death, date. The first text that is included of Melville's is Hawthorne and His Mosses, which, if you're not familiar or haven't read it in a while, is an essay of Melville's praising Hawthorne and talking about him as sort of, I don't know, he was basically Melville's favorite author. And that essay then immediately goes into Moby Dick, which is of course a novel, but the table of contents doesn't make any gestures towards differentiating the essay genre from the novel genre. Indented in underneath Moby Dick, you have the chapter selections. And one of the interesting problems with the anthology as a genre, or inversely, one of the interesting problems with the novel as a genre, is how ill-suited they are to one another. The anthologies are massive, having moved in the 60s from about 3,000 pages to the current one, which is pushing up towards 6,000 pages. But nevertheless, that still leaves relatively little space for the novel, which has been sort of one of the interesting questions that we've encountered throughout this project. You think about someone like Faulkner, who is perhaps primarily known as a novelist, and his representation in the Norton, for example, is exclusively the story A Rose for Emily. And his introduction accounts for his stature as a novelist, but of course we don't get the textual representation of that. But anyway, on the data question, we have these selections from a larger text, undifferentiated in terms of genre, though implicitly, of course, we know that this difference exists. It's just that the data doesn't give us, or the table of contents structure doesn't give us that. More interestingly, you think about someone like Spencer. Spencer has a much larger representation in the Norton Anthology of English than I'm showing here, but this is just to show the degree of editorial intervention and sub-selection that goes into the process of producing these table of contents entries. Where in the Melville example, you have numbered chapters with titles, which are quite easy to deal with. For Spencer, the Norton includes most of book one, but then in order to get to this one particular passage about the Bower of Bliss, the text subselects from, of course, Canto 12 and Book 2 of the Fairy Queen by Spencer, but in the midst of it, there's also an editorial summary in italics attributed implicitly to Spencer, but written by the editor of the section, describing what happens in Book 2 leading up to Canto 12, so that they can get to this particular passage here. So again, this is just to sort of show that operationalizing a script to pass through the table of contents and appropriately attribute text to authors is a challenge. And it's a large challenge. We estimate that there are about 34,000 of these line entries across all editions of the English and American anthologies. So it's a fairly large data problem. And we have done a lot of thinking about how we want to go about doing this. So this is our sort of wonky initial diagram about how we would go about creating this relational database. We then migrated it into a Google Sheets version, which of course rapidly began to crash as soon as we hit about 200 entries or so, which we realized would be insufficient. And then thankfully, David McClure, who is the lead developer at the Literary Lab, had recently come on board, and he has a lot of experience working with Django. So our current version of the database is a Django framework that allows us to do a sort of web-based UI capture of the information that we're interested in. And to give you a sense of how this works, Django is really, has been really convenient in having a large number of features available kind of right out of the box that allow us to do the type of relational work that we want to do. So this is just, you write your models field in Python in Django, and this is a class definition for the author, just to give you a sense of what this allows you to do. And the main goal of this, I should say, is that, of course, because we have this operationalizing problem, we're going to be distributing the labor of entering the table of contents data across a large number of people working simultaneously, which is why the web interface is incredibly valuable, and it also allows for data validation to ensure that we don't have duplicate entries and this type of thing. So to give you a sense of what this looks like, you have an open text title field here, an author field based on a set of authors who already exist in the database and to whom you can add. And this, as simple as this looks, coming up with the parenting structure was the most complex part of designing a relational database. We thought for a long time about how we wanted to represent those relations that I was showing here between the sub-selection of the larger work, of the larger work, of the larger work. And we ultimately came down to this parent-child notion, which allows us to, at any point across any of the Nortons, move back and forth up and down a chain of so-called parentage, so that you can see, okay, in every instance of the Norton that has been published, the Fairy Queen was included to some extent, but the children that were included from the Fairy Queen differ in interesting ways across the period. So we think that that's a really a useful way of thinking about the model. And the last part of this is just a multi-select for anthology inclusion, so that we can, once we've done an initial pass in the table of contents, add subsequent anthologies in which a text appears without, of course, doing a whole process of re-entry. Okay, so that's the way in which our database is working. And it relates to a larger question that we've been thinking about regarding the way in which the anthologies are structured. And the Nortons, of course, have an explicit hierarchy in some of their constructions. This is not always true. Lots of Nortons are not built on principles of like that formulated explicit high-low canon. You have anthologies that are focused on form or authorial identity, which are based on gathering sets of text together that do not have a clear hierarchical structure. However, the Nortons that we're working on here absolutely do. And it's quite corny to have these greater than symbols, but I think it's actually pretty accurate. The geographic hierarchies represented here, moving from world to Western to the English and American traditions, you have a sort of downward move from total geographic encompassment to regional or cultural down to national traditions. And the Nortons, of course, remain consistent in size across the anthologies. So the thought is that in such a hierarchical system, you would imagine that as the number of nations and peoples being represented or ostensibly being represented in a given anthology decreases, that the number of works from people, from more minor authors in a given region would increase. Okay, so thinking about this notion of hierarchical structuring and the database, I wanted to do 2 sample tests to show what we hope to be able to do with the data once we've completed doing the database entry. And as I said before, we're basically through the design process at this point, and we need to do some more testing. But the ideal version of the database will allow us to answer those questions I showed at the top. And this is sort of an initial selection. So thinking about how Shakespeare is represented in the current offering of anthologies. In the current version of the World Anthology, Shakespeare is represented by Hamlet and 5 sonnets, which doesn't seem particularly controversial. If we're thinking about, if one thinks about this again as a statement of quote unquote canonicity. Moving down to the Western literature version, however, Shakespeare's presence actually strangely decreases, going from Hamlet and 5 sonnets to Hamlet and 1 sonnet. In the anthology of English literature, his presence changes quite dramatically. We have about a third of the sonnets total, and Twelfth Night and Lear, but no Hamlet. And so one can imagine numerous reasons why Shakespeare's representation would change so dramatically across the course here. For example, Marissa Gemma suggested to us in a recent Lit Lab meeting that one might have Twelfth Night and Lear for the utility of having both a comedy and a tragedy to teach, but one might choose to exclude Hamlet because Hamlet is so frequently taught in the American public school system. These micro-narratives are interesting and thought-provoking, but I don't necessarily think that we can do quite so much with with those types of small-level considerations on an individual anthology. But what we do have is a transhistorical question of how Shakespeare's representation in the anthology changed over time. So in the first Norton, Shakespeare's representation was completely different. The first texts that were included were the songs from the plays, so Festus song and what have you, followed by the long poem, The Phoenix and the Turtle, and the first part of King Henry IV. Literally no overlap whatsoever between the first Norton and the current iteration. In 1979, King Lear is added to the initial set of texts by which Shakespeare was known in the first Norton. And then by the time you get to the year 2000, all of the songs from the plays, Phoenix and the Turtle and Henry IV, have been cut in favor of a similar set of sonnets, Twelfth Night and Lear. So Shakespeare's an interesting study in this context to think about someone who, for whom the ways in which we study him have changed dramatically, but the fact that we are studying him surprises sort of no one. One might think instead, on the other side about this matter of inclusion and exclusion, we were interested in the career of Langston Hughes to see how his representation changed over time. So in the current world literature, Hughes has 6 poems, which sort of cue up associations of his with the Harlem Renaissance, jazz, blues, etc. But Hughes is excluded completely from the Norton Anthology of Western Literature, quite strangely. And in the Anthology of Poetry, we have 9 of his poems in total. Some overlap, but not complete by any stretch of the imagination with World. When you get to the American Anthology, Hughes' representation again increases to 10 total texts. And his representation is the largest in the Anthology of African American Literature, where we have 30 of his texts. The matter of comparison is one of the things that we hope to do with the structure I described in the relational database that allows us to compare selection across time. So this is just a manual version of doing this, but we see here that there are a set of poems in this column that are included in the African American anthology, but not in the American. And notably, that's 25 of Hughes's poems. So there's actually very little overlap between those two. 25 out of 30 are new. And then Hughes' texts that are included in the American, but not included in the African American. And of course, most interesting to this sort of controversial question of canon is which poems are included in all current anthologies, which poems are sort of inextricable from the idea of Hughes or the teaching of Hughes. So of the ones in the 4 current anthologies, we only have 3 poems that are in all of them. And then once you reflect back through the history of the anthologies in the transhistorical set of anthologies that we have, there's only 1 Hughes poem that appears in every single anthology. And it is The Negro Speaks of Rivers. So the question that we come to, having done an analysis like this, is how we interpret this poem's sort of omnipresent association with the teaching and representation of Langston Hughes as a major author. Is it his most canonical poem? Is it his most representative in some way? Is it his most taught? And if not, how else can we read its presence? And I think that the answer is, there's of course no one answer to these questions, but we are trying to hold these items in sort of dialectical relation throughout this project. And I think that's been a really productive way of going from the macro level down to the micro level of the single poem. Okay, so in the spirit of the slam, I want to talk briefly about what we're planning to do next. Of course, one of our goals for the summer is to, now that we have this thing fairly well built, to actually start filling in the database. We have, we only have about the first 500 entries done at the moment, and we have, whatever that means, 33,500 to go. So there's a lot of work ahead of us there. From that, we want to move away from the sort of sample analyses I just showed of Shakespeare and Hughes into multi-author and group author analyses. One can think, of course, about demographic and gender data of authors shifting over time, percentage of text that are allocated to a given author, and one other interesting question sort of related to this, the way in which authors are grouped and introduced by critics in the anthologies over time. This is related to the larger question about the Norton as both sort of an institutional statement of canonicity by way of its use in numerous universities, and the Norton as a product and a marketplace. So we hope to do interviews actually with current and former editors of the anthologies to find out the sort of the nitty-gritty about the process of selection for the anthologies. We've set up some contacts with folks at with various editors at the Norton, and we hope to set up those interviews soon, because this is as much kind of an institutional as it is anything else. And the last and most interesting thing, as I mentioned, David McClure, who's the lab's recently hired developer, has worked extensively with Django in the past and is building a way of connecting the lab set of corpora and various other data that we have in a Django database. And he also has done work on the really interesting open syllabus project, which you can Google, which shows which texts are taught based on syllabi published online. I think they have about 1.5 million syllabi, 1.1 million. I can't remember the exact number. But the notion is to connect the Norton data that we're gathering with the corpus data and the open syllabus project data to potentially create another way of visualizing network relationships among texts and the ways in which they're taught, and of course, to do eventually some quantitative textual analysis of the works themselves. So that's sort of where we're at with the project.
Thanks so much, Eric. We'll take questions now. I have, yeah. Oh, go ahead. Oh, you go first. Yeah.
All right, well, briefly, Eric, I just wanted to ask a sort of a, this is a kind of a sideways question where I'm imagining a different information architecture for this project entirely, and sort of imagining when you're thinking about the labor issues that you're managing with this Django framework, I'm thinking about how you could ask different questions. Supposing you were to start with the first anthologies and create a like a Git repository or a content versioning system, and then just put the whole table of contents in as a set of folders. And then to create every subsequent anthology, you had to actually just commit changes. So you see, in a way, the interesting thing about your analysis phase to me is that once you've collected your spreadsheets of data, which are implicitly or explicitly parallelized around your authors and your texts, and you've controlled for all of the slight changes of names or inclusions of middle initials, essentially, you still have to implicitly find this narrative of an object or objects branching, cross-pollinating, or being modified over time. So if the anthology world, say, is an object that was then, they don't start from scratch every time and produce 90% the same, but it's being modified, are there ways that it would make sense to actually use the modification as a form of data collection, or what questions can you answer or couldn't you answer using these explicit versus implicit models?
I love the notion of basically redoing the last 50 years of Norton work on GitHub. I feel like that sounds hilarious. So we're coming at this, we decided to go in this order because we initially had considered moving chronologically furthest in the past to the present. And the reason we settled on going backwards were the sort of twofold reasons. One being that we assume that the metadata about authors in the current editions is the most accurate of the set, thinking particularly about the Middle English volume and authors' various birth death dates, which have changed over time. So we're going with that. We're going with the naming conventions for authors. One really key example would be that Mark Twain is known as Samuel Clemens exclusively until the fourth version of the anthology. So that would make data reconciliation kind of hard. I feel like that's a really fascinating, it's a fascinating idea, and I wonder if it would be possible actually to coerce the data to do that after we've generated the tables in this way, actually. I wonder if it would be possible to perform the inverse branching structure and kind of just flip it once we've gathered it in post. This is speculative. I'm not actually sure if it's doable. But it seems like it could be, since we'll have inclusion, exclusion data from various anthologies. Maybe a conversation for another time. But the open question for me in a way is, if the kinds of questions you're most interested in asking are the kinds that would trace kind of explicit changes, articulations of changes over time, then how reconcilable your data is to a change-based data structure representation is how well it can answer the questions you want to ask, right? But let's, it's a very exciting project, so let's maybe follow up.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eric. As you know, of course, I'm super interested in your project. We're there. I really appreciate how you're looking at all these different kinds of Norton anthologies, and I think that'll prove to be really interesting. My question is potentially not answerable, but really I just want to know more about what you may have discovered. So you were talking about how you're taking into account genre
in the Norton and trying to see patterns over time. I was just wondering what, if you have been seeing changes, like is the marketplace more interested in certain genres at certain times? I mean, that seems like that would be just such a fascinating discovery. And then just thinking back to, you know, works that have really hit the market hard at different points is, for example, like Beloved. Why is Beloved so popular? Or as I talked about this morning, The Street. Why did that hit popularity at such a time in the 1940s? So really, I was just wondering if you found more patterns in genre or other patterns.
I fear that I may have misspoken. I think what I was talking about with the Melville section was the difference, like we can recognize Hawthorne and His Mosses as an essay and Moby Dick as a novel, but unfortunately the table of contents data does not provide genre markers. We could apply those ourselves in collecting the data, but that sort of amounts to an editorial intervention external to the Norton, and I kind of hesitate to do that for text that exists in sort of a liminal generic space. But I would love to be able to answer your question, obviously. We've talked about how we might try to account for things like genre in alternate ways. And of course you have something like the Norton Anthology of Poetry, which everything in there is, or nearly everything in there is poetry. And if it's not poetry, it's like an influential essay on poetry. And one could imagine reconciling presence in the Norton Anthology of Poetry as a near proxy for genre, and we could talk about presence and absence in that way. But beyond that, unfortunately, the editorial policies of the Norton don't provide much. But I'm similarly interested in those types of questions. I think the one thing that our current data structure really does allow us to address is the role of the excerpt and the changing size, scope, character of which text is being excerpted. So I talked in the Shakespeare thing about which texts are chosen to be representative of Shakespeare, and I think what the excerpt allows us to see is which texts are being chosen to teach or to think about a given author across time. And again, we don't have the data yet, so I will come back next year.
Awesome. Alan.
I don't know, we don't have much time. This is Alan Liu, Eric. It's really an impressive project. It's going to be exciting to follow. I have a suggestion, which is that as you present the project in the future, when it's finished, you might want to add a kind of rationale statement to guard against the impression that you're being too respectful of the assumed parameters of the anthology form, that what an anthology is a modeling of relationships between authors, works, and so on. Traditionally, literary history has one escape from that. It speaks of movements, trends, circles of people. But I'm thinking to myself, if I'm in the digital humanities field and I see you applying all these methods to anthologies, why couldn't you use the same methods to model the relationship between styles or discourses or corporate entities at scales other than authors, circles, and movements? That is, are we being too respectful of the assumed parameters of what an anthology is?
Yeah, that's really useful. I had tried to guard against that by sort of diagnosing or explicating the contents of the anthology at the outset, but I don't think that actually does much more than say what it is and unapologetically perhaps go ahead with an analysis of the Norton as such. The pamphlet will absolutely be critical of that aspect of it, but for like as an expediency for the presentation, I kind of glaze over it.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Ryan.
Eric.
Sorry, Eric. Sorry, I was just Skyping with Ryan, and yeah, so I just used his name. Sorry. Thank you so much, Eric.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, now I will get Ryan.
So now you can thank
So I was just
because he's waiting in the wings.
Hi, Ryan.
Hey,
Um,
how are you? Hey, Alan, I'm
Yeah.
just talking on YouTube, so it's strange to see you now.
I wish I could have been down to that UCLA event. It looked really great on Twitter yesterday. Yeah.
Oh, it was a really great thing. Yeah,
awesome.
I'm a little hooky today. Well, it only went from the morning, but I just got into a class. So should I go right now? Are we still reading?
Yeah, I'll just introduce you real quick.
Okay.
So this is Ryan Huser from the Stanford Literary Lab. His talk is called Word Vectors in the 18th Century. We're ready for you, Ryan.
Okay. So can you see my screen?
It's coming in.
It's taking a moment.
No, it doesn't work.
Not yet.
We're back to video view.
Okay, I'm just gonna pick one.
There it is.
we go.
Got it.
And that's full screen now?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I wanted to give at least a short version of a talk of some work I've been doing the last couple months on word vectors in the 18th century, I'm calling it. Basically the question, I want to introduce this new method called word vectors and just basically ask some questions about how this might be useful for 18th century literary studies or literary studies more generally or DH more generally. And I'm afraid I'm just going to try to get through as much as I can in 15 minutes, but I kind of want to jump to the end of one of the most interesting things I've done and then go back to the beginning just to make sure that we get there. So I just want to show this slide. So I'll explain how we can get to this at some point, but effectively along the x-axis, so all these dots are the 1,000 most frequent nouns in the corpus of 18th century literature. And along the x-axis, if a word is left on the x-axis, it's more closely associated with the word simplicity.
Ryan,
It's
we're
on the
getting
right on the x-axis, it's more closely associated with the word refinement.
Ryan, we're still seeing your initial PowerPoint titles shot.
Oh, there
okay, got it.
Okay, it updated.
Okay, I think I changed full screen, so let me just do that.
All right.
Perfect.
Yeah, so if you see these dots, these are the 1,000 most frequent nouns. So yeah, to the left you have words associated with simplicity. To the right, words associated with refinement. Those are two big, aesthetic abstractions in the 18th century. There's debates about whether it's better to have simplicity or refinement in writing. But then on the y-axis, if you're on the top on the y-axis, it's a word associated with vice. On the bottom, a word associated with virtue. And so if you can see on the top right corner, there's words like luxury. So those are refined vices. You look at the top left quadrant, you have a word like murder. It's a simple vice, effectively. On the bottom right, you have refined virtues like science. But on the left, you have a whole range of simple virtue, like honors and blessings and even fathers and mothers. So I just show this to say that one thing word vectors can do is help us index the correlation between concepts and conceptual contrasts. So obviously the conceptual contrast of morality and immorality is a very big deal in the 18th century. And there's this other aesthetic contrast between two kinds of writing. And they both seem to orient discourse in a similar way. And that helps us index what kinds of semantic correlations are going on in the period. For instance, I just want to show one more. We can also do this with gender. So actually the contrast between simplicity and refinement is gendered in the period. Hume has an essay on simplicity and refinement. He compares simplicity to a beautiful woman with makeup on. And so this is another example of how when we say something is being gendered, one way to sort of analyze that would be to say that, in a word vector's terms, would be to say that the axis of gender, the semantic axis of gender, actually correlates with some other semantic axis we might be interested in. So that's the end. And I'm going to just ask the beginning and do a little introduction to what word vectors are. I'm going to try to move through this a little quickly. But I mean, we can think about a vector in at least two different ways. So we can think about a vector in programming, it's just a series of numbers, however many. Or then a vector in space, it's a line with a direction and length. So A and B are two vectors there. There's a line from the origin of the graph toward A, toward B. And we can get the distance between vectors A and B either in Euclidean space with D, or we can measure the cosine of the angle between them. That's another way to get the distance between those two vectors. Okay, so that's just vector in general. If you think about it, we've been doing word vectors in DH. Every time that you represent a document term matrix, the horizontal row there is just the vector for term 4 is the series of its counts over document 1, document 2, etc. So that's one way to think about a vector. Just if you think about a term document count matrix, that's a vector. Or another one would be a term matrix. Anyway, but the problem with this is that these end up being really big. So there's these new methods of doing multi-dimensional semantics, making word vectors, instead using neural networks. This comes out of artificial intelligence research. And neural networks do a whole range of things. It's machine learning. So you give them some task that they have to do, they learn it. And then they learn it through creating some kind of hidden internal representation with these artificial neurons. So in this way, every word gets a completely random series of neuron firings at first. So I like to think that this is like the kind of cyberpunk version of John Locke's tabula rasa.
We seem to have lost a connection with your audio, Ryan.
Your audio has stalled out since tabula rasa.
Oh.
Hello?
Hi.
Yes.
Hi.
We lost you. Tabula rasa was the last thing that you had said.
So he's doing Wi-Fi from his hotel room.
Oh, is that it? I would say actually let's leave the video off. If he's choked for bandwidth, there's no reason for. He doesn't need our pixels.
Hello?
Oh, you're back in audio.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Okay, good.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave just the screen. Okay, so let me just give basically the word vectors use a neural network to put words in a kind of neural network space. Instead of with traditional word vectors, you put a word in a kind of space of its counts over documents. And what's cool about that is this is still working?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's
Okay, so what's cool about that, why people, so this has been a thing since about 2011, and it's actually creepy enough. Google made this algorithm, Word2Vec, and it blew people in natural language processing's minds because it can, an accidental byproduct of the semantic space that the neural networks create is that it actually can represent mathematically analogy. So it can tell that queen is to king as woman is to man. And I want to look at how that works here, but rather than look at this graph, graph, if we think about this as one of these sort of operations at a time, think about what woman minus man might be. And that sounds creepy, and it has sort of gender political implications that I would talk about at the end. I'm not sure I'm going to get to, but think about woman. Numbers. On the left-hand side, you can see the mathematical aspect to that subtraction. But because the vector for woman is supposedly capturing certain parts of the semantics of what that word means, we can imagine that aspects of the semantics of the word woman might be, well, a woman is a human being, a woman is an adult, a female, a noun. And then semantic aspects of the word man, well, a man is a human being, an adult, a noun, and male. So when we subtract woman minus man, we create a vector that's actually neutral with respect to human beingness. Like human beingness falls out because it's been subtracted away. The semantics of adulthood fall out, they've been subtracted away. Nounness falls out. And the only thing that's left is the semantic axis of difference between woman and man. And potentially the most salient axis of difference between those two words is an axis of gender difference from female to male. When we think about queen minus king, it's sort of the same thing, because even though queens and kings are monarchs, because they're both monarchs, the subtraction queen minus king is neutral with respect to their being monarchs. And the only axis of difference, again, between queen and king is this axis of difference of their gender. So because the queen minus king reveals an axis of gender, just as woman minus man reveals an axis of gender, we might say that they're sort of equal. But then if we just algebraically, if we add king to both sides of this equation, we get back to this original equation that expressed this analogy. And this works, we can see this working out graphically. If we just think about three vectors, woman, man, and king. And if we subtract woman minus man, we subtract 0.5 from 0.3, 0.2 from 0.4, we get a vector negative 0.2, 0.2. So this is our red vector of woman minus man. We can draw that from the origin point as it is here. We can draw it from man and get back to woman. Or we can draw it from king and we point at this new space in the vector space and we ask, which vector is closest to this in the vector space? And it turns out to be queen. And the reason why it's queen is that queen lies, to get directions from king to queen, you move along the exact same vector of difference, the same axis of difference that you do when you move along from man to woman. So it seems like magic, but that's how it works, is that the reason why vectors can get these analogies is it actually does something very similar to what we mean by an analogy. When you make an analogy, there's an implicit construction of some kind of shared semantic axis of difference, even though the four terms in the analogy are very different, right? So anyway, that's a toy example, and I might only just be able to get through, I want to do a little close reading of a particular analogy in the 18th century. This is from Edward Young. This is an arcane but influential argument for authors to abandon neoclassical imitation. Young wants people to stop imitating Homer, and he does that by making this moralistic analogy that learning, which is associated with imitating the classics, is to genius, which he associates with making new compositions, just as riches are to virtue. And so this is a very 18th century form of argument where you take what you're arguing for and analogize it through some kind of moral analogy. So you can read the quote if you want, but that's the point. And then what was so provocative to me, I don't know if this is statistically significant or not, but if you ask the model, riches are to virtue as learning is to what, genius is the sixth most likely term. And I just want to ask, if that were to happen, why could it have happened? So I mean, with this example we were looking at before, it's easy to see that the red axis of difference between queen and king and man and woman, etc., was probably gender. But if we replace all those words with virtue and riches and learning and genius, what would this red vector mean now? What does virtue minus riches mean? And so we can do the same kind of semantic subtraction table. I mean, this is all just interpretive, but one way to think about this would be virtue is a form of value, but so is riches. They're nouns, they're abstractions. But two salient differences would seem to be that virtue is immaterial. Riches or wealth is a material entity. And virtue is inherent individual in the individual, whereas wealth is sort of accumulated and contingent to the individual. So those would be two axes of difference that virtue minus riches might express. So if we go back to thinking about, if that's our interpretation of what that red axis might mean, the movement from the contingent and the material toward the inherent and the immaterial, then if we start at learning, which is in the 18th century, it has this kind of class-based connotation. You go to Oxford or Cambridge, you have a kind of academic pedigree. If that's what learning means, and if the vector virtue minus riches moves us away from the contingent and the material toward the inherent and the immaterial, then it makes sense that we would get to genius. Because learning and genius are both attributes of a writer, right? But learning has, again, this academic and this class-based connotation that we've moved away from by moving away from the contingent and the material. We move toward this inherent immaterial writerly attribute, which is genius. And so I hope that makes sense. That's the way that I'm thinking about how we might even be able to close read word vectors. And then I've been doing some experiments, doing some distant reading, and I don't have too much more time, so I think I'm going to just skip to. So this is if I've done some previous work on semantic fields. And these are just words from the of the 100-dimensional vector space. And all this shows is that the vector semantics sort of corroborates existing these are the abstract values, semantic fields are all abstract words, and they occupy one big space. Concrete words occupy into the vector space. And then
Ryan, we're losing your audio. We lost you completely. We're still seeing your screen though.
Oh.
We were. Well, I think we're almost at time. Try to move to Q&A and just do an audio. Just having you do this. If we get back.
hey, hello.
Hi, Ray.
Hey. Maybe I should just stop there.
Let's
I don't know.
let's move to Q&A. Maybe if you could mute your video to preserve bandwidth, and we could just do an audio Q&A.
Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
I'm going to ask the first question. This is Alan, Ryan. So I've gotten really interested in word embedding and word vector issues as well, at least conceptually. I'm not as far along as you in implementing, experimenting with it now. And I've gotten kind of interested in this meta issue about the space in which word vectors are imagined and calculated. So think along with me this way. 1975, a art historian named Jay Appleton wrote a really rogue book of art history called The Experience of Landscape, in which he tried to analyze the space in landscapes and in pictures from the point of view of animals, not of human beings. And especially from the two distinct kinds of animals, predators and prey. So he built a whole theory about open space versus refuge space, lines of escape, lines of vision, and so on. So I'm thinking to myself along these lines, a word vector, let's say king, is imagined as an entity with how many different inflections. So king has a masculinity dimension, has an authority dimension, has a physicality dimension, and there's a different way for each of them. And this can go on for hundreds of dimensions at one time. That's too complex for the human mind to deal with. So in order to calculate all that, we project that onto a two-dimensional Euclidean space. That's where you're showing the vectors and the arrows and so on. I'm wondering myself whether the Euclidean space onto which we are projecting a reduced dimension understanding of word vectors could be imagined differently for different cultures and for different psychologies. So if you think about that Euclidean space, its premises are that it's infinitely extensible, that it's infinitely traversable without friction, that it's continuous, and that it's uniform. But if I were a prey animal, or if I were a refugee, or if I were a persecuted population, would I be more comfortable thinking in something like a Hilbert space with a different topology, which makes frictionless traversability difficult, which makes analogy difficult rather than easy? I guess what I'm asking is, what are the larger sort of cultural and social implications of reducing complexity in this particular way to a two-dimensional Euclidean space?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think in general, and maybe this is going to be sounding too optimistic, maybe I'll just reveal that I'm still maybe a bit too in the honeymoon phase with this method, because actually what I like about it so much is that it seems to get DH a bit beyond two dimensions more. I mean, I think it was a polemic last year actually about how many graphs in DH have history on the x-axis and then a single dimension of a cultural formation on axis, whatever it is, word frequency or whatever. But it has this implicit suggestion that a cultural formation can be reduced to a single dimension. Whereas, you know,
Ryan, we're losing your
to
audio.
sort of summarize.
We lost the last sentence or two.
I was just saying, yeah, I mean, the fact that sometimes it's necessary to project vector space, which is like 100-dimensional onto 2 dimensions, is regrettable. And yeah, I guess it must involve a whole nother layer of like cultural translation. Those 2 dimensions can mean very different things to different people. But I was just saying that before that step, when semantics really is 100-dimensional, I think that there is a new level of cultural information that it's a little bit harder to think about, but that there's so much there. And to just speak for one more second about topology, you mentioned topology. I mean, one of the experiments that I have been doing on this is making a semantic, I'm calling it a semantic transportation network. So the idea is that you have all these abstract singular nouns. So you have passion, understanding, and reason, and virtue and vice. You can't get from any one of them to any other. You can't jump from passion to correspondence because the semantic distance is too large. But you might be able to go from passion to intimacy to friendship to correspondence. And so at least there, by projecting it not into 2 dimensions, but into a network, more of the topology of the semantics is preserved. For instance, if you run a betweenness centrality on that network and find which is the node which word connects the most distinct number of communities in this semantic network. In the 18th century, it's passion. Passion connects to positive affects, negative affects, feminized words connects to negative ethical words, positive ethical words. It's incredibly interstitial within this semantic topology. And that makes sense to, the 18th century about the discourse of sensibility in the late 18th century that sort of conflated ethics and affect. And so even though that's not really surprising, but I think it shows that the dimensions in vector space can reveal sort of really interesting semantic topologies and don't necessarily have to be bound to a kind of Cartesian two-dimensional space, at least. But anyway,
That's a good
maybe
answer.
that's a bit too optimistic of a response because I think there's something more deeply political in your question that I'm not sure I responded to.
No, that's a good response.
Do we have time for one more? I think we might be over time.
We're 2 minutes over time, so it's quick, but otherwise we can move forward. All right, Brian, we're out of time, but we'll thank you for your talk. That was great.
And we'd like
Well,
to
thank you guys, and sorry for the Wi-Fi. It was working fine earlier. I don't know what happened. Murphy's Law. Sorry about that, and thanks so much.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you,
yeah,
Ryan.
we'll follow up with more questions later.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm on Twitter or send me questions and however, and I'll be on the YouTube.
Looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, thanks guys.
Can you put my PowerPoint on the sheet?
Yeah.
Or? Hi. Hi, Patrick. Haven't seen you in a while. Incidentally, our colleague on campus, John Moore, did a study some time ago with a colleague about census records and church records from the early part of the 20th century. The discourse by which poor women and fallen women were classified for charity relief purposes. And the kind of a semantic graph that he drew there really brings home the last point that Ryan was making, how impossible it was to get from certain positions in the semantic network, such as poverty, to other positions like fallenness, as applied to women, without going through 5, 6, or 7 hops. So part of what the reduced dimensional space does is to allow for those kinds of analogies to be made without having to go through that kind of opacity. So it's kind of interesting, as you can see, social political issue.
It would be, in a way, it would be interesting to test the topology of those spaces to say, for example, it's not a property of that space. I would assume that the vector between 1 and 2 is the vector between 2 and 3. Yeah. Right. So certain kinds of, if we were to look generally at how analogy works with a logical analogy, with another kinds of analogy, and look at which ones, that is to say, the topological may be evident in no matter how the Euclidean is represented as uniform, what analogies do and don't play out, and what are their specific characters in cultural objects, that will reveal the topological unevenness of the gap between culture and the flattened space.
Is it not going in? Well, I can't wait to get started with the experimentation with word to vec here, and what they call word embedding, which is a word vector analysis here. You couldn't see the fine detail of the charts that he was showing, but what they really show is that through those subtraction and multiplication linear algebra operations on those word vectors, each of which has hundreds of dimensions of inflections of meaning what a king is, what a queen, you can produce a proximity of word to word in that multidimensional analogy space, which almost duplicates, and people say does better than topic modeling at thematically clustering things.
It's really tough to get in there. Probably.
What are you trying to get in there?
Just a flash drive.
The flash drive, but it's really, the position is so tough to get in. I think I got it.
Oh, I see.
But it's not here.
Okay. Well, we'll just try one more time, and if it doesn't work, then and I'm assuming that keyword doesn't have on a focus.
Want to look at my laptop or?
But if not, yeah, that's what I would say would be let's just switch to it. Oh, I see. It's because of this little tensor switch. Okay. Well, let's try it this way. There, that should do it. If this is.
Okay. Right. Here's Alan Liu on For Humanities, What Everyone Says project, initial work and future plans.
So most of you actually know something about For Humanities and What Everyone Says. For Humanities is in part an advocacy initiative. We're doing practical projects. Get ready. Finally, after about a month and a half of delay, our famous panel of judges have gotten their act together for the contest that we've been advertising for almost 2 years now. So we should be able to announce winners for that in about 4 days, I think. And some of them are quite spectacular projects. So that's a representative of the practical arm of the initiative. We also have a research arm of the initiative as well. The current project on the table is called What Everyone Says. So thanks to Tyler, by the way, for this particular image, which is on display over on the 4K screens over the libraries in this research laboratory, among other exhibits. What we're trying to do is address the way that the humanities, liberal arts, and in the Commonwealth countries, what they call the arts, are being understood by the public and by legislatures and others at large. Now, we know a lot about that. We know that people talk in kind of memes about the humanities crisis, about the decline of humanities majors, about the relationship between the humanities and the sciences, and so on. But there are open questions, such as what is the structure of that particular discourse? Has it changed over time? Does it correlate with particular cycles of economic and political activity? Also, what do we not know about what people are saying about the humanities? What falls outside the narrow ruts of those particular memes, which may preoccupy us a little bit too much since we ourselves are professional humanists in the academic quarter. So we began a project. It's about 2 to 2.5 years now. It's been running on a small level of academic senate grant funding, internal funding here at UCSB. This is the project team. Faculty members include people on here at UCSB. Jeremy is one of the lead team members. Bishop Cantor from writing. Lindsay Thomas, who was formerly here as a graduate student, now at the University of Miami. She's a member of the project. And just down the road, Scott Kleinman at California State University, Northridge. Plus, we've had a large group of graduate students who have been involved as research assistants. Currently in the room, for example, Ashley and Jamal have both been involved with the project. And Patrick was an early veteran of the project as well. We also have one undergraduate involved, and we have as 2 advising consultants, some people very good for this purpose at Underwood and Andrew Goldstone. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to scrape and harvest plain text from a fairly large set of newspaper and magazines representing discourse in currently the United States and the UK. We're trying to extend to Canada as well. Discourse about the humanities. It's a fairly wide open aperture. We're just searching for mentions of the word humanities and liberal arts. And in the UK, also the phrase arts. That's more of a difficult scraping operation. As at the end of last summer, we had about 30,000 documents harvested and scraped, and the metadata prepared, almost prepared for all of that. So the research foci of the project blur in an interesting way, as any project like this does, between the thematic focus of the project and the methodological foci as well. So one of the things that's quite interesting about the project that we have not solved, but should probably think about more, is that this is work with an unbounded corpus. It's very different, for example, from the work that, for example, the Stanford Literary Lab does, or Mark Algie Hewitt, with a defined corpus of 19th century novels, or with the Evo text. Here we have a potentially infinite corpus. And so this is going to require us to think about how to bound that how to define it, and how to scrape it. It raises issues of representationalness of the sort that the Stanford Literary Lab have also dealt with. It also raises issues of corpus linguistics. In fact, if you think about what we're after something like a corpus linguist version of a corpus. That is something that is designed to be representative, even if it is not comprehensive in any particular sector of the public discourse space. A second focus is, of course, into the project, we knew already that we wanted to model focal discussions about the humanities. And that means obviously things like whenever Stanley Fish opens his really big mouth about the humanities, then we want to consider that. That's what I mean by focal discussions of the humanities crisis, decline in majors of the humanities, etc. But it turns out that because our aperture is so wide open, anything in a neighborhood of the humanities and liberal arts, we're finding that an even more interesting problem, theoretically, conceptually, is the ambient discussion of the humanities in the public sector. And so what does that mean? It means that when people publish obituaries on the New York Times or elsewhere, often the obituaries mention the fact that someone had a background in the humanities. Again, an amazing number of wedding announcements in New York Times and elsewhere mention background in the humanities, some kind of connection with the humanities. Even stories about the military, it turns out generals have had humanist training. There's some kind of connection with the humanities. So as we began to think about this issue, we began to separate out into two different camps of considerations. One, the focal discussions about the humanities. And the other, this is my metaphor, the cosmic background radiation of the humanities. That is, if you think about public discourse, it's not far-fetched to think that public discourse would be much impoverished if we just subtracted all the mention of the liberal arts and the humanities. There's a kind of a cosmic glow that's there in the background. If you visualize it as a heat map, sometimes the humanities are glowing brightly. Those are the focal discussions. Sometimes it's cool in the background. That's a kind of ambient default level of the humanities. Research questions for the future. What does that cosmic background radiation look like in one sector of the world versus another? Is the glow brighter in the west than in the east, vice south, north? Who knows? Lots of research questions could be asked about that. Also, what is the structure of ambient discourse? How does it evolve over time? Another research focus, this is kind of interesting. We want to create a reproducible protocol that is involving both machine learning and human interpretive exercises for the interpretation of the topic models that we want to build out of our document set. So I skipped that in my presentation. The first thing we're after right now is topic models of this document, this set. But that, of course, once we have the corpus developed, there are other methods possible. I really want to try out the word vector approach, for example, that Ryan was just talking about. But whatever approach we have, we face this impasse in the field of digital humanities right now. We have people who assert interpretive generalizations about, for example, their text analyses, their topic models, etc., any kind of analytics. But there's no reproducible protocol for that act of interpretation. So I'd like our group, and we begin to think about this, to develop a draft workflow that involves both machine learning and human interpretation. That is, what is the rhythm of work by which you develop a topic model, then talk about it together, examining concrete use examples, then go back to reiterate the topic model, and then go back to reinterpreting it. It would be very nice for us, for example, to collaborate with the Stanford Literary Lab. When Mark L.G. Hewitt is running his panel groups to decide on what is suspenseful or not. You may have heard his their presentation here about the suspense project last year. In essence, they are developing their own kind of protocol for combined machine learning and human interpretive activities. It ought to be the case within the next generation of the digital humanities and new media studies, I think, that we develop a understood, shared consensus set of protocols for how you do analytics interpretation that does not depend on assertions that are non-reproducible by individual researchers. So that's something we're after. Finally, this is very ambitious. Scott Kleiman at CSUN is taking the lead on this. We want to develop and are in midway of developing a provenance system for digital humanities analytics work that is appropriate for the humanities. Scott is calling this the manifest schema. It's a ontology and provenance tracking system similar to provenance systems for the sciences, where they are further developed than they are in the humanities. It's going to be implemented in a lightweight, portable language, probably YAML, which can be ported out in JSON into a NoSQL database. It's going to be a way of tracking what we got, how we got it, where we got it from, what we did to it. So right now, the state of the art in the digital humanities is there's no state of the art in digital humanities. When Ryan Huser gave us the 3,000 novels that they based so much of their novel work on the Stanford Library Lab for our people to experiment with, it came on a flash drive communicated to Tyler, right? I think Tyler brought it down here. But there's no provenance on that flash drive, meaning where did you get this stuff? How did you get it? What did you have to do to it to get in this form? And who set their grubby little mitts on it to get into that form? For the scientists, of course, this is a big problem because if the standard of knowledge, the gold standard of knowledge in the sciences is reproducibility, then reproducibility is meaningless unless you have all the factors known about what made that experiment possible at that time. What was the data set you used? What were the instruments you used to collect it? Who collected it? What did you do to it to get it into that form? So we like to find by comparison with the sciences, lightweight set of provenance protocols that would work for the digital humanities. And that means being able through a set of forms that are a flow through lightweight portability of, of formats like JSON into a database of the materials that we collect and the processes and scripts we use on it in what particular sequence. That should allow for transparency in the future. So Alan Dew and his team got these results, and this is a set of steps they took to get from point A to point Z at the end. So that's something we're trying out right now. So current methods that we're working with, we're creating our own data scraping flows, text mining. This is quite a big learning experience. Those who have done this work know that, of course, 80% of the labor, time, sweat, blood, and tears is at this level of things. We've been trying to document some of these workflows. For that, for example, our New York Times API collection and scraping workflow. We're beginning work with topic modeling. So this is a topic model of, I think, the year 2014 mentions of the humanities in the New York Times. We're beginning to do experiments with clustering operations on the topics that we discover to ratchet up the level of machine learning involved in interpreting topic models. So if you take a topic as discovered by mallet, which consists of a weighted a set of words, convert that into a document, then you feed that a document into clustering algorithms, you get, in essence, what amounts to a clustering of the topics. So this is a PCA analysis, principal component analysis of a set of topics, a k-means, Voronoi space cluster analysis, and of course a dendrogram hierarchical analysis. So these are ways of taking, let's say 100 documents, 100 topics that you discover, and kind of visualizing which ones seem to cluster together. So just saying to my students today, this is seems to be very inarticulate work by comparison with the standards of humanities interpretation. But actually, simply knowing how many parts of the phenomena there are is very powerful interpretive work. It's a kind of a high-level first-pass work you need to do. The first thing you need to do to understand a field is know, does it have parts? And what are the difference between the parts? So that's what these clustering operations are after. So beyond that, we're going into moving our material into dynamic visualization and topic model browsing interfaces. We've discovered fairly quickly that simply producing the topic models gets us nowhere unless you have real-time exploratory tools that allow you to look at these from different angles and look at them. So we've done a study recently, and I'm not going to bother clicking there, but we looked systematically at the 14 topic modeling visualization interfaces that we know about so far. DFR browser, here, ConVisit, there are 13 others ones. So some observations about that. We've found that for our purposes, probably Andrew Goldstone's DFR browser is the most capable for a number of reasons in helping us think about topic models. Another observation, in all 14 cases, of the 6 or 7 we've tried to implement, none were implementable and reproducible in someone else's machine without, it seems like, months of labor. All of these platforms in the digital humanities are created right now in a way that are reproducible so long as, and this is my metaphor, so for example, DFR browser works if you happen to be riding a bicycle while juggling 2 plates next to a dancing bear, and there happens to be a tree with that particular Python library in it. So we face a situation now where sometimes we can get these working on one person's machine. It's completely non-replicable on someone else's machine. So state of the art for us right now, Jamal and Jeremy are taking the lead. We're trying to move in the direction of a virtualized development environment for all this that we can simply push out. We get this implemented on one environment and keep reiterating that so that people can share in the particular work. The third observation I'll make from this exercise is that I'm not showing you the web version of this now, it's online. We have, it's clear from the 14 examples of topic modeling interfaces that as a society of researchers, we currently don't have a consensus of what the paradigm of a topic model is. We have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different visual metaphors or paradigms, including social graph networks, for example. And that's just a clue that we just don't actually get it yet. We have this word topic, which we think we know what that means, and we associate it with words like theme and so on. But when we actually try to express it in visual form, that's a clue to the fact that we simply don't understand these higher dimension spaces that we're dealing with, similar with the word vector approach that Brian is dealing with. So end goals, there are 2. About a couple of months ago, the Cambridge Concept Lab came here. Peter DeBalla was talking about the architecture of concepts. That's one of our end goals, and the other one I'm going to put together with the phrase frame analysis. I'll close my talk very quickly with a synopsis of what these means. So when I introduced Pete DeBalla, I introduced him as something like the 21st century version of Arthur Lovejoy on the history of ideas. When intellectual history arose, Lovejoy was after the structure of complicated ideas in the history of ideas. And he had a kind of a chemical molecular metaphor for it. Ideas were these molecular things, atoms bonded together, and they configured themselves over time. Pete DeBalla's book, The Architecture of Concepts, which I recommend. In fact, next year, I think I want our whole team to do an exercise on this book. It's kind of an updated version of that. He wants to think about, in his case, the example is human rights as the concept developed since the 18th century. Very complicated idea. He wants to understand its internal structure and also its connections to external structures of different kinds. And he's developing an entire kind of a conceptual vocabulary for how complicated ideas that have social impact are actually internally articulated and also externally articulated with other discourse concepts in society. So that's what we're after. We want to understand topics in a way that can slot the topics into structured notions of what that theme or topic actually is. And you think about it, this is a very good match for our research focus on the humanities. The humanities is precisely this kind of complex, fuzzy topic which has internal structure as well. It's highly articulated in the academic domain. It's very fuzzily and loosely articulated in the broader social domain. It has exactly the same kind of nature as a topic like the human rights from the 18th century. That moves in the direction of complexity. The opposite end goal moves in the direction of reduction and simplicity. A lot of people use frame research and frame analysis. This comes out of cognitive psychology. George Lakoff is quite well known here, and it's been taken on seriously by media theorists because of the nature of media discourse today, which gravitates toward sound bites, toward the reduced dimension articulations of truth. So as you may know, what George Lakoff and others means by frame is the reduced little mental model we carry around our heads to make meaningful, complicated social and other phenomena. So the Strategic Frame Analysis Institute has a very nice tutorial online, and this is one of their examples, which will make it clear. So advocates for fluoridation in water say, for example, early childhood tooth decay is on the rise. The reaction from the popular public is poor oral health in children is a symptom of bad parenting. So those are two different frames at work. On the one hand, a set of thematic or policy level frames that have to do with the social conditions, larger context. On the other hand, we all carry around in our head this little reduced model society. It's like a family. There's a mama there, there's a papa there, and there's a kid there who's not brushing their teeth, okay? So to make things meaningful to the public, say the media theorists and analysts, you need to be able to frame them in a way that intersects with the little mental frames that they have already in their heads. Question then becomes, how strategically do you do that? How do you change frames? How do you opt out of frames into which you are already locked so that you have mobility to move to some other frame? What I'd like our project to do at the end of its text analysis and topic analysis of ways of talking about the humanities is to be able to diagnose the kinds of frames in which legislators and others now talk about the humanities to allow for greater mobility of what the humanities are about into other frames. So I'll stop there. Observations, question, Thomas? By the way, if you haven't met him yet, Thomas Padilla, who's just joined us a couple of months ago, he's our new digital humanities curator for the library.
So yeah, as the data curator, I'm really interested in the documentation process, the attention to reproducibility, and so forth. And I'm curious how the work that you're doing in that space, how you envision it mapping to publication, and the extent to which current publication infrastructure necessarily has the capacity to support the type of documentation that you're developing in terms of allowing peers in larger communities to actually make use of the frameworks that you're developing. I'm just thinking, because I cast a pretty wide net trying to get a sense of how not just scholars, but perhaps practitioners are approaching this. And particularly, I've been really interested in what data-driven journalists are doing. In particular, at outlets like BuzzFeed, of all places, where they're starting to publish their IPython notebooks, where they're basically they're annotating at the paragraph level in their article, and then linking out to the exact script in their IPython notebook that's being used to generate the data that supports the claim that's being made in that particular paragraph.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious if you all are thinking about how this necessarily reflects on.
Yeah, in fact, you've hit a topic that I've been on email with Andrew Piper and the other editorial members of the board of the new Cultural Analytics Journal. We've just been talking about this the last couple of days. So this is a long-standing concern of mine. It starts something like this. I have this whole mini lecture about this, which I'm not going to lay on you, but it starts like this. Back in the good old days of humanities research, we knew how to present our evidence, and we knew how to reproduce that evidence. Basically, we said, here's the evidence, a short block quotation, and I'm going to analyze in situ right here. That's what I'm going to do. If you want more, go to the library. Okay, so that was an understood procedure back then. That's what we meant by producing the evidence, right? So now things have gotten more complicated. So Andrew Piper put out on the list to his editorial board 2 days ago the question, what should be the policy statement for cultural analytics, the new journal for reproducibility of the data sets in the background here? So a bunch of us, including Lev Manovich, the Chicago people, very long, and so Richard Stowe have been chiming in on this. And it looks like we're heading in a direction of this. A minimalist policy statement saying that it's a good practice to put up, publish alongside your article, the data set, the metadata, the actual code, and in an open repository. And then 3 or 4 scenarios of examples of how to do this, depending on whether your primary data is reproducible or not, for a number of reasons. One is size, the second is copyright issues, and so on. So it does look like in the humanities now, but already in the other disciplines. We're moving in a direction of standardized best practices for publishing alongside the narrative or interpretive work about a project, the actual data set, the metadata, the code used in the processing steps, as well as, by the way, this is one of my recent suggestions, the lowest common denominator portable format of the data or metadata. That means if you publish an article in the digital humanities field in the future, you should be expected to publish a plain text version of that so someone can easily, topic model it or something like that. So I think that's the direction we're headed, but the standards aren't in place yet, and the protocols aren't in place, and the repositories aren't in place. So right now we're having this five-hand discussion about what is the right data repository to put your data set in. I'm suggesting something called Dataverse, but you'd have to implement that at your institution because it's open, because it has automatic data citation mechanisms, and also has a neat what they call universal numerical fingerprint hashing function. So you can tell at a glance whether the data set has changed in the background since the last time you cited it. But other people are suggesting Mendeley, which I don't like because it's part of the Elsevier operation now. And so, I mean, obviously, Thomas, you know that we're in this evolving transition period, and we just don't know what the standard is going to be.
Interesting. It sounded like you were alluding to the creation of an environment, right? So not just the documentation. There's a prior conversation about experimenting with Docker or something like that.
Yeah, ultimately, that's where I think we're going. That basically, you publish your article and you publish not just your data set, you publish that virtual machine.
That's right. You
So,
just publish the whole, you give them a copy of your lab, basically.
By the way, Richard So was pointing out in our email discussion that because of scandals about the reproducibility of evidence in the sciences and social sciences, now some of the journals in those fields are demanding replication of the data processing before they will allow the article to be published. So you have provided your code and data in a format that allows the third party to replicate the actual processing result before they will publish your article. So we're not there yet in the humanities, but Jeremy.
And just briefly, in your final comments about framing, one of the things that was interesting to me to think about was the ways in which, sort of tying back to the previous talk even, the way in which productive failures might produce findings. That is to say, if in analyzing the corpus, you are able to, say, detect rhetorical frames and the kinds of utterances that would fit into a set of things which you could then define as frames. I'm being very, very vague here, right? About the humanities, then there would be a certain number of utterances that would not fit very well, not be detected, not be clustered, and those things which are failures of the machine learning algorithm or the clustering algorithm or the neural network might be the most interesting objects in this case because they are quote unquote unframed. So in that final goal of thinking about alternative frames or lateral movement, what are the utterances that in the entire corpus that we're least able to recognize? Has that uniquely almost humanities data that the remainder is the thing of the greatest value.
Frankly, I think that could be the real sweet spot in our end goals. I mean, think about the nature of political discourse right now, which is so partisan. What that means is that everyone has locked onto certain semantic markers in the field as theirs, right? And there's no movement. So where are the things that have not been claimed yet? Because that's where the opportunity lies, right? Something that has not been locked onto in people's bubble universes. That's where the potential for changing minds might occur. There's a lot to think about in this regard. We just don't know well enough what the nature of public discourse is. I mean, we have a sense of it, but we just don't understand its structure. We don't understand how many of these open areas exist, how that has changed over time. For example, are we really more partisan now than we were 20 years ago? How would you measure that? What does the structure of partisanship today look like compared to what it was 20 years ago? These are open research questions. So, I mean, frankly, what I most love about this kind of work is the open research question, things that may or may not have empirical answers to them. We just don't know. I'm teaching my student undergraduates now and on next week about social network analysis. I mean, the open questions there are just amazing. Like, how many major kinds of networks are there? What are the relationships between physical networks and social? I mean, there's this umpteen open questions that may or may not have empirical answers. We just don't know the answers. I love that. Okay.
Great, thanks. Oh, you're there.
Is that my
Would you like me to do swaps?
This is shorter. Yeah, it's been tough to get in there. So next up, we have Lisa Hahn from UC Santa Barbara. The title of her talk is Digital Methods of App Analysis, Mapping App Ecologies in the Google Play Store.
You want to close that notice at the top, so it's not lingering.
So today I'm talking about a project that I did last year as part of a workshop with Digital Methods Summer School called Digital Methods for App Analysis, Mapping App Ecologies in the Google Play Store. The theme that year was on host node and empiricism and secondary social media. So this work was really trying to get sort of social media out of it. But before I go into this, I'm just going to introduce the context a little bit. So the Digital Methods Initiative is an internet studies research group based at the University of Amsterdam, which is founded by Professor Richard Rogers. And the idea behind it in a nutshell is it's an effort to repurpose dominant social methods for research. So by method, what Professor Rogers refers to is like the methods of the medium. So things such as crawling, crowdsourcing, PageRank, tag clouds, etc. And then some of the questions that are asked by DMI include things like, what can using proxies tell us about internet censorship? What can hyperlinks tell us about site reputation? How can related site algorithms help us understand server pathways? So the idea is that by repurposing these pre-existing methods, we can better reveal how people actually behave online and then come to understand how the methods themselves change. So I think a really important piece of this is the difference between the digital turn and the computational turn. So the computational turn, from the point of view of DMI, is the idea that we need to just import computational methods into research, and that and DMI, kind of in contrast, is responding to this classic big data critique, is that when all we're doing is just injecting computational methods, we're moving from interpretation to pattern recognition, or that it's the critique of distance reading, that you're not doing actual content analysis. So I think DMI is really trying to add back that element of focus on content. And I think this might be kind of a political premise, particularly for people coming from media studies, which is that, for instance, when you're studying social media data, you're actually learning something about society itself rather than just the social media platform. So I think digital methods is definitely sensitive to the critiques made by people like Carlton, Gillespie, and Lisa Gittleman, who say that raw data is cooked, data needs to be recognized as mediated, platforms are ideological interventions. But to some extent, they're also saying that maybe there's something to be gained from thinking along with these tools as opposed to just thinking against them. So that's kind of the situated context of digital methods. So the actual project that we worked on was focused on app ecology. So broadly, that's the ways that apps are organized and connected to one another. And we are looking at them through app stores. So these are the app gatekeepers that present users with certain app ecologies. And they're obviously owned by companies and driven by profit motives, but they also are home to a huge range of apps, from social networking to dating to niche tools, in addition to a huge number of third-party apps that tack on to these mainstream apps. So it's an important cultural space that we want to understand a little bit better. So the main questions kind of generally are, how do apps sort of organize the app ecology space? And how do they allow users to engage with that space? What kinds of ecology types occur, which is not a question but in order to better understand that, we then focus on a case study examining popular religions. And in the process, we're kind of looking to highlight how these apps are presented to users who search for them in the store, right? So modeling that actual process. How are religious apps organized by and connected across the Google Play Store? So that's kind of a question of understanding repurposing the platform logic of Google Play to understand a certain fabricated space of culture. And then what we wanted to find was what we called the technicity of religion, or the totality of digital tools used to perform a religion. So the meat of this is really in coming up with a method, actually. So the first method was semi-manual, and this basically first involved list building, which we did using keyword searches into App Annie, which is an app analytics site that actually just ranks apps in the Google Play Store for popularity. So we queried words related to the religion we're interested in, 2 keywords for religion. So we did Christian, Christianity, Jewish, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhism. And then we limited our region to the United States from the date of July 1st, 2015. So step 2 is that we then culled the top 100 apps from the Google Play Store using App Annie, and then saved those in HTML files. And we loaded each HTML page into a text editor, then to remove formatting, pasted that into a harvester tool, and then basically the goal was to extract the URLs. Essentially, all of the app URLs have the exact same URL except for the ending, which was the app ID, which is what we wanted to get. So that's actually kind of fortunate that they were all sort of built that way, because it made it really easy to do the next step. Step 3, which is to append each app ID onto a different URL that is basically common to all search results for similar apps on Google Play. And then using import.io, which is a tool that allows you to extract data into a CSV from a URL with a list of information. We then created 100 CSVs of the similar app networks for each of the top 100 popular apps. So that basically was appended onto one giant spreadsheet and then converted into a TXT file. And so basically the app ecology there is that the apps are connected to each other through the similar apps section of Google Play, and then retrieved initially based on their popularity on search. So having experimented with this kind of labor-intensive manual method, we then were able to basically take it to computer scientists who automated part of this process for us. So now all we needed to do was get the top 100 apps, collect the app IDs, and then put them into this tool that would just automatically generate a network graph file for all the most popular apps, and they're similar to recommendations. So having done all of that, we basically split up, we made separate network graphs for each religion and then analyzed each one. So to get to the graphs themselves, basically we were looking to identify clusters. So I'll just go through a couple of these. Islam Muslim, the largest cluster was Quran-related texts, and then a lot of apps related to specific religious practices, compasses, calendars, and prayer times. Judaism had 3 main areas. There were the religious texts were the largest cluster, so that's like Bibles, prayers, and song-related apps. And then there was another large cluster for lifestyle apps, which include things like kosher restaurants, dating apps, and then finally Jewish media. So this one was actually pretty similar to Christianity, for instance, which also had quite a large lifestyle area, as well as a lot related to music. And then the third example I have up here is Buddhism, which was quite a bit different. So you have like a ton of music, a lot of dictionaries for translation and market apps, but unlike the previous religions, you don't have things like ringtones, no dating sites, no wallpapers, no news, and no kids section. So the next logical move after doing this is to append all of the graphs and then look for similarities and bridges. So here, this is hard to see from here, but what we found in this kind of super graph was that calendars tended to bridge religions and connect literature. We also found significant crossover between certain religions, so Christianity and Judaism frequently appear next to each other. Hinduism and Buddhism are also close together, so like the green and red, this is Buddhism, Hinduism, and then Christianity and Judaism are yellow and pink, so it's like these clusters. You see that they are, certain religions are more interconnected, I suppose.
And what are the connections? They're also recommended on the recommendations on the store.
Yeah, basically. So they're so like when you go into one app, you get a list of recommendations of similar apps.
Got it. Okay.
So that's kind of the process that we used. I think there was actually one app in particular that was kind of a super bridge called Duties of the Heart, which is just kind of funny. The description in it was a unique work that linked East and West philosophies, combining elements drawn from the mysticism of Arabs, from biblical and rabbinic Judaism, and from Greek thought. So the final, and I think most interesting aesthetic representation of this was we actually combined some of the functionality of ImageJ into Gephi and then replaced the node images. And this was sort of loosely inspired by Lev Manovich, who's been really interested in combining the graphical and the photographic. So he kind of does some similar stuff with his own image plot tool. I'm not so sure how useful this actually was. I mean, I think it's a little bit incomprehensible with just the images. Probably would have told a little bit more, but I think just as an aesthetic representation, it's kind of interesting.
In Lightform, could you drill in? So when you drill into the images expand, or?
Oh, actually, I don't know if this version on the PowerPoint expanded on.
But in the live form, are you able to do that in
Oh,
working with the original live tool?
in the original, yes, I believe so. Yeah, I mean, in the original, it's a Gephi file, which unfortunately I don't have otherwise. So, in any case, so the conclusions we basically made were that one, app ecologies are in fact shaped by the nature of religious practices individually. So, for instance, the Islam Muslim faith contained a lot of calendar apps, compasses, prayer time apps to assist with daily rituals or Ramadan in particular, while other religions kind of shared attributes like wallpapers and ringtones. They also had varied in their emphasis on these sort of things, and particularly in the lifestyle space, which would include things like food or dating across religions. This was, a project that was done in a week, and so there were a lot of questions that we didn't take up that I think could be really interesting for future research. One of them is to compare app ecologies across platforms. So obviously, how does Google Play compare to the iTunes App Store? We went with Google Play because it just happened to be the easiest, actually, particularly with App Annie, but it would. So iTunes App Store would probably require a different methodology, but if that could be done, it would be really interesting. The other question, how does store-generated ecology differ from a user-organized ecology? So I think this is a really important question that we didn't address, like to what extent, how influential is this ecology actually in use, and to what extent do we resist the store logic? And I think that would require some more work on the user end and more thinking through. And then lastly, we can explore further categories. To some extent, this project was really about developing methodology, and that methodology could be imported into spaces such as education, business, thinking about other minority groups, LGBT. So there's definitely a lot more that can be done, but that's in a nutshell.
I'm just curious in terms of how you gather the data initially. What are Google's criteria for similarity? I mean, how are those network connections actually being generated on the back end?
That's a good question, and so that's actually like black box information to us, right? We don't know exactly what the algorithms are, but we made the decision to basically take them as they are because they are so influential, and that is how people interact with that space, and basically, not try to suss out exactly what's happening on the back end, but rather kind of go from there, like knowing that this is how it is, how are people actually affected by it. But that's a great point. We don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just thinking about like the way that there's been so much work put into breaking down what Google's criteria for PageRank are. SEO as a field is basically how to figure out exactly that.
Yeah.
It's interesting to, for example, thinking about this talk alongside the first talk of the day by Ashley with work on Amazon. One of the things Amazon exposes is customers who bought this also bought. So they make explicit in some way the behavioral component of part of the data that they're exposing. So you could imagine hypothetically that a few little user studies, the sort of screen-based user studies might be really useful in trying to interpret this, because if on the one hand, if users only use the App Store search bar for everything and completely ignore the recommendations, then you're studying a network as that's a purely rhetorical effect of the corporation, right? Because people aren't moving through that network. It's just an artifact on the screen.
Right.
Whereas if the network is built through people who also bought logic, and people are actually using it to navigate, then you're studying the topology of the user space, right? Not the topology of a kind of corporate utterance, that is, but that is not a navigation network.
Yeah, it does matter. I think to some extent the position of DMI that they're simply going to go with the tools rather than try to interrogate them is a little bit of a cop out in certain ways, right? So this is how it's really important questions about, the difference between user generated and company generated model.
Yeah, and I guess I'm just piggybacking off of what Jeremy just said there about just sort of the topology of the user space. I was interested in the directionality of that first statement of the conclusion, just app ecologies are shaped by the nature of religious practices, and sort of partially based on what I presented on earlier today, but also just based on my interests in general. I flip that and sort of think about that going in the opposite direction, the possibility of the nature of religious practices or any type of practice, being shaped by the app ecology generated. You can think of something like religious practices and sort of what practices go into an app ecology that you glean from it when you use it. You can also think of something, I don't know if you know about the I Am Rich app that came out a while back, and sort of apps, the possibility of an app being good, and the status that may come with that. So I don't know how you would get, I'm just wondering how you could or would possibly get to something like that, get to analyzing something like that influence of the app ecology on religious practices or any type of practice using these methods.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I honestly don't know how one would go about collecting the evidence to support the claim that the apps themselves influence practices. And I think just intuitively, it must be a kind of dialectic back and forth. I think I wish I could answer your question better, but yeah, I think that's a really good question. Yeah.
Lisa, some of our students in this generation and previous cohorts have been to DHSI and so on, but I think you're the first of our group of students who have gone to DMI in the summer. Maybe you could just tell us all about what it's like there, what the working arrangements are, how you got this done in a week. I mean, just fill us in on.
Yeah, so it's really great. I encourage people to do it. It's a 2-week program. Usually there's a theme going into every summer. So basically the first day or two is spent kind of on introductions, workshops, kind of learning about some basic tools, and then people actually, it's pretty much open to whoever has an idea for a project. Will go up and do project proposals. So it's actually, so it's one project per week, and yeah. So basically, everyone goes up and presents who has an idea, and then anyone in the room basically who's interested in a particular idea signs up, and they kind of sort through which topics have the most interest, and put people in groups. And based on if one project maybe didn't have enough interest, then they might put some of those people in other groups, shuffle them around. But basically, they kind of go by whatever you are interested in, and then you work together in basically a workshop with a variety of people. So you have every group I think has somebody who is a designer and somebody who's a computer scientist to help basically facilitate how you're thinking about the end products and things, or what tools you're going to use. And then at the end of the week, you have basically everyone presents their projects, and so it's really kind of loose, and at the same time you learn a lot just by kind of going through this process. So
is everyone there basically Dutch, or is it a wide variety?
there are a lot of Dutch people. Yeah. There's actually there's not a strong American representation there, which I was really surprised by. But there are a lot of people coming from different places, a lot of social scientists, people who aren't necessarily in the academia attend. But there are also a lot of people who are kind of coming from the clinical side of it, like I was. So I think the fact that there was just such a variety of people really made it helpful in that sense. I think you kind of realize the different ways that people are thinking through these issues. And then the speakers that they had were excellent. So actually, Les Manovich was one of the keynotes for the time that I went. He talked about Software Studies Initiative and actually ran a couple of workshops teaching people his tools. So that's kind of why we added that final experiment at the end.
Do the projects have an afterlife? I mean, for example, your project on app ecology, is it leading toward maybe an article or something? Or?
I don't think ours has, but I think some of them in the past certainly have had a longer life. I haven't kept track of which ones ended up becoming larger projects, but certainly a lot of them seem to have. I think some of the project heads probably were the ones who might have taken it up after the workshop. Yeah, but I'll have to look into that actually. I don't know.
Thanks so much, Lisa.
So thanks so much for. Oh yeah. I'm sorry. So thank you all for coming and participating in SyncDH. I'll just have some brief closing remarks on the conference, and then we still have lots of refreshments in the other room if you would like to stay and Wow, I just did that without even thinking. All right. So we had some great presentations today. I really enjoyed this. We had a number of presentations that really connected to each other, but learned about apps and the Amazon and vectors and digital objects and ways that we can look at culture through digital methods, but also how digital methods inform culture and change culture. The idea behind the conference is to sync up or connect digital research communities without the high cost of airfare so often demanded by conference travel. So recently we also had Ken Hiltner's 0 or 1% carbon conference. This is similar in that regard. The UCSB Transcriptions Research Slam is in its 9th year, which predates the SyncDH. And we loved the Slam. It was posters and everybody walked around the room, and we really wanted to incorporate that same spirit, but then we also wanted to expand it through SyncDH. And so we wanted to expand that by including other research communities. And the real way we thought of to expand that was to digitally connect people through Skype or pre-recorded presentations, as we saw today. And I guess one thing I knew along the way is there would be a lot of errors in this method because anytime you're doing all those different sorts of things, there's going to be errors. But I really think that there is a lot of benefit in learning this and in trying to experiment with new conference methods, and that this is how we get to really connecting with research communities. We also really wanted to still have the on-ground, in-person part of the conference. We didn't want to lose that through online, through a completely online conference. So we really tried to plan the day so that there would be lots of time to talk and meet people in the conference. So we know that our conference day was small here, but there was also a live audience always watching, and it's streamed throughout the whole conference. So we'll have that video available, and then we hope that more people then watch that video and then connect and then ask questions further on Twitter, but that the conversation continues, and that audience is much broader than this room, and it connects those research communities. So we connected today with University of Oregon, which talked about their digital humanities program they're trying to build there, and what it's like to build a digital humanities community in a university that doesn't have that program at all. And then the Stanford Literary Lab, of course, which was also here last year on ground. So the purpose, though, beyond just that the conference today was small and the people in the rooms, there were few, is that the purpose is big in that we really wanted to allow research communities to connect both on ground, in person, and also to research groups around the world, maybe, in this particular time, West Coast. But we think this is a format that could really connect a wide variety of communities. So thank you again so much for coming, and there are refreshments in the CRC still.
Let's thank Ashley for organizing this.
Oh, yes.